Attorney Natasha Hausdorff, shalom.
Shalom, it's wonderful to be with you.
Welcome to our studio. Welcome to Israel. Welcome to Jerusalem. You're here for the special conference countering anti-Semitism. You've been in this field for how many years already? 10 years, right?
Some 10 years that I've been very privileged to work with a wonderful organization. It began as a voluntary association of lawyers, UK Lawyers for Israel. And more recently, I've taken on a responsibility as the legal director of our charitable trust. And through that work, yes, countering anti-Semitism and anti-Israel initiatives through legal mechanisms.
Now, one of the things you're warning about, especially also during this conference, and in the past few events that you've been talking on the media, is the weaponization of international law. So if you could elaborate on that.
It's a phenomenon that unfortunately has been many decades in the making. We have seen Israel targeted as the Jew among the nations, if you will, with false representations of international law, misrepresentations and manipulations. This is unfortunately an agenda of lawfare, and I see lawfare as an abuse of international law. This is not real international law that's being discussed. And what it is essentially involving is a weaponization of international legal institutions and legal terminology.
And it's getting worse. You're warning that it will get worse. You're saying it didn't even start, relatively speaking.
I think we're very much at the beginning of this process. Undoubtedly, everyone is now very well aware of what is happening at the ICC and at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. But this has been decades in the making and the build-up to these practices. A lot of this has come from the legal academy at universities, where there has been a concerted effort to promote anti-Israel agendas and to essentially rewrite the rulebook on international law, and that has inextricable links with the legal practice and what we've seen developing at these international legal institutions. And yes, I'm afraid it's probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better. But I hope one thing that will become apparent to Western liberal democracies is that what starts with Israel is very unlikely to end with Israel. And the sorts of weaponization of international law that we've seen with respect to Israel is a threat to Western civilization as a whole.
And does the West understand this or not yet?
Not yet, I'm afraid. I know that we have seen a significant shift now with the current US administration and its sanctions against the ICC, the International Criminal Court that sits in The Hague. It is an indictment, I would say, on the member states of that court, which of course Israel and the US are not, but the member states of that court, including the United Kingdom, that they would allow a court to act in a fashion where it has no jurisdiction, where it has essentially broken its own rules, in particular the rule of complementarity, where this is a court that is meant to complement existing domestic jurisdictions, not to replace them, but also as something that UK Lawyers for Israel has pointed out, to essentially issue arrest warrants on the basis of a slew of misinformation. We reviewed the public summary that Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the ICC, put out when he applied for arrest warrants against Mohammed Daif, Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu.
In the same list. It was crazy.
That in and of itself is, I would suggest, reprehensible, but what was also entirely unacceptable is that every phrase of every sentence of that application summary was false. And so this court, the pre-trial chamber that issued these arrest warrants,
false, total lies?
Entirely false. So the main allegation that has been fabricated here is that of starvation. We have shown also separately through a famine review report that the reports of the IPC committee that predicted starvation and famine in Gaza were entirely incorrect. In fact, they have also subsequently been determined to be implausible and based on only partial information by other UN bodies. But what we specifically did in relation to the public summary that was published by the prosecutor Karim Khan was demonstrate that every phrase of every sentence was false information through a very carefully footnoted analysis and review. And instead of acknowledging that, perhaps reviewing the material that was put before the court, the response of the prosecutor was unfortunately to tell the pre-trial chamber to ignore any submissions on accuracy that did not come from the prosecutor's office.
How much of this is coming from hate and how much from ignorance or the fact that Israel is a sovereign state, etc., etc.?
It's a very good question, and I think it's very difficult to determine because this misinformation has been continuing for so many years now. I fully anticipate that many people believe what it is that they're being told. And of course, the added factor here, and I travel the world now speaking to politicians, policy advisors, officials, who frequently tell me that they base their assessment on what is happening in terms of the war in Gaza on what they're seeing on television. And we have to be clear that the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, you name it, those broadcasters they're reporting from Gaza are essentially serving as Hamas mouthpieces, because we know that nothing is reported from Gaza that is not approved by Hamas. That is because Hamas control Gaza. And so long as these broadcasters are putting out material without a warning that indicates that there is no free reporting coming out of Gaza, they are simply serving as a Hamas mouthpiece. And they are misinforming not just the general public, but it seems increasingly the people making policy decisions around the world. And that in and of itself also feeds into the legal arena and the weaponization of international law against Israel too.
You've been in this field, as we mentioned, for almost 10 years. Are you still surprised sometimes from how absurd the claims are, how crazy the lies are?
Sometimes I am surprised.
Yeah.
I recall a recent suggestion that Israel was engaging in cannibalism against Palestinians. There was also an appalling recent report by the UN that suggested that Israel was using sexual violence in Gaza. I mean, all of this, unfortunately, is projection and not just an inversion, but an indication of what has been perpetrated against Israelis. I'm reminded in particular of the 2000 lynching in Ramallah of 2 Israeli reservists, where the reports at the time, and there were images circulating, of the attackers eating their livers. I mean, the notion that Israel would now be accused of cannibalism is a complete projection of what has been perpetrated against Israelis in the past. Oh. And unfortunately, likewise, with these absurd allegations of sexual violence, unsubstantiated, Israel, let's not forget, is a country of law and order. To the extent that there is misconduct in the armed forces, these instances are investigated. They are prosecuted if there are credible allegations there. And that is something that the international community seems to brush over. The fact that there are legal processes in place here to hold any individual perpetrators to account. What we are witnessing in the international community and these allegations of misconduct as a matter of policy of the Israeli government are fabricated, they are untrue, and they fall into that sort of traditional blood libel against the Jewish people.
So I asked you if you were ever surprised, and my other question is, how many times did you say, yay, we did it? I'm trying to ask, people look at anti-Semitism and sometimes give up. The world is against us, the UN is against us, the people hate the Jews for centuries, since the time of the Bible. Can you tell me, no, there have been many successes throughout these 10 years?
There have been many successes, and I don't mean individual successes even in terms of stopping BDS resolutions at local authorities or helping students on campus. I mean, there have been countless successes on that front, but also pretty major ones that do, I think, move the needle along the way. I mean, I noticed a complete U-turn by the International Committee of the Red Cross that was demanding on a legal basis, supposedly, access to Nukhba terrorists who are not prisoners of war and therefore do not enjoy the benefits under the Third Geneva Convention, including Red Cross visits. I recently saw an evidence session in the Houses of Parliament at the Foreign Affairs Committee where that was finally acknowledged. Now, that is a significant U-turn, a recognition of real international law and the Red Cross's powers and authorities, which frankly, is completely contrary to what we were being attacked on by the International Committee of the Red Cross only a few months after.
That's in terms of authorities. When you're in front of a crowd, and you have also the time after, do people come over to you and say, you know what, that was an eye-opener?
All the time. And that's extremely significant. And sometimes, I will be frank, I do feel a little bit like a broken record, but it is so important because every time I'm dealing with these fundamental issues of international law and its misrepresentation, I see the light go on people's faces, and people tell me, I've never heard that before. This changes everything for me. I'm going to be reviewing, engaging, reading as much as I can, and I'm going to be questioning what it is that I've been told up until this point, because you have shown that there is a great deal more to investigate.
So that was what I was going to ask you as the last question, is what gives you koach, what gives you strength? And that's what it is?
A mixture of things. Knowing that we are here on the side of truth, and as a barrister I take my professional obligations extremely seriously, a commitment to the rule of law and to making sure that the law is properly applied and not abused is extremely important within that. But I also am frankly flooded with messages from around the world, both from people who have taken enormous strength and encouragement from hearing the truth put out as far and as widely as I'm able to, but also those who have written to say, you've changed my mind. And to the extent that we can engage with reasonable, open-minded people, and they recognize, as I mentioned earlier, that this is not just Israel's fight. This weaponization of international law is a fight against Western civilization. Ultimately, we have experienced several decades in the international legal arena where we have rule of law countries like Israel, like the UK, like the US, who view law as a restriction, a curtailment on government power, as against the despots and the dictatorships of this world, who view law as a means of wielding power and who have sought legal protections, even for their terrorist proxies, throughout the international legal framework. This is a war that is much broader than simply Israel's, but as ever, Israel is very much at the front line of fighting it on behalf of Western civilization. And the more people that recognize that, the more will there is amongst the West to stand up and be counted and to push back against the abuse of legal institutions in this fashion. I think the better equipped everyone is going to be able to fight this war properly.
So you're continuing, that's for sure.
For sure.
Okay, attorney Natasha Hausdorff, thank you so much for joining us and good luck.
Thank you so much.